Hello, I've spent some weeks doing all sorts of teachy talks which have come out on a Thursday through the Tardy Big web page on Facebook and the Cafe Church Tardy Big YouTube channel. And for a long time I was doing introductions to books of the New Testament, and then I threw in a collection of talks about leading and following. But at this time when we've had an enforced cessation of usual church worship, I thought I wanted to say something about God's vision for church buildings. Now, when the church started, they didn't have buildings of their own. This was a matter of necessity. Firstly, they were persecuted by the Jews and then by the Romans. So having a building you were obviously going to wasn't a very good idea. And also in the fledgling community, the earliest church wanted to get away from the idea of that sort of a building. They wanted to do a brand new thing. This took time. There was a transitional period where Christians and Jews did meet together, and sometimes that would have been in the synagogue. But Christians would gather together in people's homes, and some of the big Roman villas, of course, have big courtyards in the middle as well. Sometimes they would gather at another meeting place, perhaps by the river, or they would find each other in the marketplace. Sometimes they had to be very secret about it, and so being inside in someone's home was pretty much the only alternative. But the Christian community grew, and in the 200s we know that one or two places were beginning to be built or created specifically for worship. And after the toleration of Christianity in the Roman Empire in the 300s, church building starts in earnest. And Helen, the mother of Constantine, who was converted to Christianity, pioneers some big church building, including the church in Jerusalem. In other words, the early church didn't see a specific church building as being a necessity. Now, this is something worth remembering, because today in many countries Christians aren't really allowed to have church buildings and wouldn't necessarily be wise to go to one. And yet the church can still flourish and prosper. So they meet together in people's homes, and they will network together in relationships. I think that's much closer to God's vision for church. But what we need to have is a balance, because you've still got to have church leadership, oversight, all this business I was talking about shepherds and sheep, if you watch those talks. And then there are gifts of ministry gifts. Well, ministry gifts work when you meet together. So there are the gifts of the Spirit that are listed in 1 Corinthians 12. There's the gifts which really are associated with leadership officers in Ephesians 4. And they're there to build up the church, to enable ministry and to enable others in ministry. This is apostles, prophets, teachers, pastors, and evangelists. And of course, you can't do that unless people are meeting together and having contact. So these small groups in people's homes were the basic unit of the church. And in many parts of the world today, they still are. They are building blocks from which a larger church fellowship networked together is administered, by leaders who are devoted to preaching and prayer, to ministering Jesus from place to place, not necessarily in a static place at all. Now, the way that these units work also means that you do not have a single leader who does everything. One of the mistakes I think that the church has made is to have big single figures upon whom everybody else is relying. This de-skills the church spiritually and in terms of its leadership. And so that is why you get the idea in the New Testament that those with spiritual authority are in oversight, but they're not doing all the ministry on the ground. And in fact, you wouldn't expect them to. We have a scenario which is a little bit more like that today. But then let's come back to our church buildings. What are they for? Firstly, they're there to meet, to gather together in a significant number of people. You can't put many people into a person's home, so to gather together in any numbers requires a church building. And especially in this climate, which is often cold or wet or windy or something, a heatable space is crucial for us in this country and in countries of this latitude and quite a long way south of here as well. Then there is a place that's set aside specifically for worship, and a place that's been prayed in and worshipped in and preached in can have particularly especially attracted the presence of God, so that when people come into that building, they begin to sense something of God, even though they have never been to a church service. This is something very important to remember, that what we do in a space, any sort of room or space, affects the way that place feels, the sort of spiritual atmosphere that it has. And this is so true of churches. And if people have upheld the reality of God, have invited the presence of the Holy Spirit, have prayed in that place on a very regular basis, the atmosphere changes and people who come in sense it. Church buildings are iconic buildings in the community. They stand as testimony to Jesus Christ just by being there and being visible on the skyline. And you know, the Muslims really understood this, because they established their minarets everywhere, and you go to a Muslim country and you can see those on the skyline. You go to a country with Christian heritage like ours, and all over the country you can see churches on the skyline, and you know the difference when you go to a country when they're not there, and all those spires that you can see stretching across from habitation to habitation are absent. So our church buildings then become gathering points not just for Christian people but for the community as a whole. The problem with them can be that they become so expensive to maintain, particularly when have them classified as a heritage object, that we spend more of our money maintaining a museum piece than we do reaching out to others or to providing for the poor. And Christians feel the tension of this. Major building projects can raise hundreds of thousands of pounds of cash, if not millions. But if we had that money to spend on educating children in Africa, we could transform many lives. And there's a balance there that we struggle with. if we're relying upon church buildings. And some of us, you know, our faith has been placed so much in a single church building that we find it difficult to worship anywhere else. Well, we're going to spend eternity worshipping Jesus somewhere else. So it would be a good idea to get used to worshipping Jesus in more than one place right now. The crucial thing is to worship in spirit and in truth. To worship Jesus directly wherever we are. And it might be on our own, it might be with other people. It might be with people we know, it might be with people we don't know. But if they're Christians, we have a family relationship and we will be able to worship effectively together. So, buildings have a role, but they're only a vehicle for something else. And it's the something else that we really need to concentrate on, to cherish and to develop, which is our personal or corporate relationship with Jesus Christ. So, let's all take our personal responsibility to search for God, to chase after God, to meet with Him personally, in small groups, in large groups, in courses, and Holy Trinity provides some wonderful courses to help us to engage with Jesus. But let's not get hung up by the building that we do what we do in. We give thanks for the buildings that we don't have to build them, we don't have to hire them. But let's do all we can to make sure our buildings are in the best possible state to enable worship to take place, so that we can worship freely and we can worship together. But if we have to worship somewhere else, let's do that. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today and forever, and He's far bigger than a single building. And so should we be. The Lord bless you and lead you forward in your faith wherever He sends you and wherever you find yourself to be.